You might think that being a royal doctor was the height of honor, a golden ticket to courtly luxury, respect, and power. But if your patient was King Henry VIII, you weren't entering a palace. You were entering a cage, a perfumed, silken, candlelit cage that slowly squeezed the breath from your chest. Once you stepped into his chambers, you didn't walk out again without permission. And if the king's pain didn't go away, you might vanish altogether, not into retirement, but into a grave. In the final decade of his life, the body of Henry VIII was a decaying monument to excess and denial. He was no longer the handsome prince who jousted for glory or penned love poems by firelight. He had become swollen with meat and wine, tormented by ulcers that reeked through linen, and so heavy that a hoist had to be installed above his bed to lift him like cargo. He refused to face his own deterioration. So instead, someone else had to. That someone was you, his physician. And whether you were the most educated doctor in all of England or simply the last one still breathing after a week of failed treatments, it didn't matter. You were stuck. The door behind you had closed. The wound on his leg, a gaping, rotting crater oozed with pus, so foul it could clear a corridor. Yet it was sacred. No one dared speak of it plainly. When you approached it to clean and dress the ulcer, you had to bow as if greeting royalty, even as the stench turned your stomach. If he groaned, you apologized. If he screamed, you begged. And if he lashed out and struck you, as he had with others, you thanked him for the honor. You worked not with medicine, but with theater. Every treatment was a ritual, every bandage an offering. The meals did not help. Henry feasted like war was coming. Every day was a parade of roasted boar, mutton, pies stuffed with game, and sweetmeats soaked in syrup. Vegetables were for peasants. Water was suspect. He drank wine like water, and mead like tea. His doctors begged him to stop, to consider a broth, a pear, anything green. But kings do not compromise. They command, and so he grew larger, heavier, angrier, a throne bound in flesh. It was between the years of 1545 and 1547 that everything changed. That was when the weight became too great, when the ulcer refused to close, when the king no longer stood without help, and every shuffle toward the privy was an ordeal that required 4 men, 2 poles, and a trail of febrile groans. By then, the royal physician was more prisoner than doctor. You were not allowed to leave the palace grounds. You could not write freely. Every note you made was copied and read. Every whispered diagnosis had to be wrapped in compliments. His Majesty remains vigorous. You wrote, even as his breath grew sour and his bowels failed. The worst moment came during one cold night. Deep in winter, the king had a fit, whether of gout or rage. No one could say, and summoned his doctor at once. You arrived, half-dressed, carrying a flask of mulled wine and a salve meant for horses. The room was dim, lit by a single candle that flickered against the shadow of the sovereign's swollen face. He cursed, rolled, clutched at the sheets, and pointed to the leg. The smell was unbearable. You reached for the bandage, trying to keep your hands steady, when he grabbed your wrist with a strength that did not match his condition and snarled, "Make it stop, or I will stop you." You nodded. You wept. You worked. And the next day, you stayed in your room, unable to speak, unsure if you had saved your king or damned yourself. When Henry died in early 1547, he did not pass gently. The rot inside him bloomed. His belly swelled and burst open inside the coffin. His remains leaked through silk and onto the chapel floor. The stonemasons scrubbed it, but the smell never quite left. You, the doctor, were forced to examine the body one final time, to sign off on the death of a man who had consumed his kingdom, and then himself. And when it was done, You did not stay for the funeral. You slipped out a side gate before dawn and disappeared. They say you lived quietly in the country, that you never again touched a patient, that when asked about your time at court, you changed the subject. But the truth is, the palace never left you. You woke from dreams drenched in the scent of old blood. You flinched when meat roasted on a spit. You heard, always, in the back of your mind, that voice deep, desperate, royal, saying, heal me, or be buried with me. And in a way, you were buried with him, not in body, but in spirit, because being Henry's doctor was not a role, it was a sentence. And though the king is long dead, the prison he built remains. In memory, in legend, in the silence that follows a scream no one could ignore. The palace was not what it seemed. From the outside, it shimmered with pageantry, high stone walls draped in ivy, stained glass windows catching the sun like liquid rubies. The distant echo of lutes playing beneath golden arches. Courtiers walked with elegant steps across polished floors. Candles flickered behind heavy velvet curtains. Servants whispered as they passed, always with their eyes down, always with one ear tilted toward the throne. But once you stepped inside, once you became part of the king's inner circle, once you were his doctor, you began to see what the paint and polish tried so hard to hide. It was not a palace. It was a cage, carved in limestone and silence. You were not called in, as other physicians might be, to examine the king, offer a remedy, and then return to your life. No, once you were summoned, once the king allowed you to see the sore beneath his bandages, the stink beneath his silks, the sweat that pooled in the creases of his flesh, you belonged to him. You were no longer a man of science. You were an instrument of survival, his survival, and you could not walk away. No physician who tried ever did so freely. They gave you a room, somewhere above the kitchens. It had a window. Yes. But the view was of a blank courtyard where the horses relieved themselves. There were locks on your door, not for your safety, but for theirs. You were not a prisoner by decree. You were a prisoner by duty. And by fear, you could walk the halls. Yes, but only when summoned. You could eat. Yes, but only what was served after the king's meals had concluded. You could speak, but never about what you saw. The corridors were always colder than they looked. In the great chamber, tapestries of Arthurian knights billowed with the wind that should not have been there. Somewhere, a servant had opened a door for fresh air, or perhaps to let in a prayer. The palace breathed in such a strange way. It was full of people, and yet deeply alone. You could walk past 20 men, and no one would meet your gaze. The moment you became the king's physician, you were marked not with ink, but with something heavier. Everyone around you could smell it. The closeness to power, yes, but also the danger of that proximity. You did not heal him. You carried his rot. And what rot it was, the palace itself seemed to bend to accommodate it. Wherever the king slept, the furniture was adjusted, the floors reinforced. The chamber pots doubled. Your days and your nights became a loop of waiting. Waiting for the call. Waiting for the guards to knock. Waiting for the king's groan of discomfort that meant the wound had opened again. Or the fever had returned. Or the dreams had clawed at him once more. Sometimes, in those quiet hours between dusk and the deepest midnight, you would sit on the edge of your small bed and listen. There was always a sound. Somewhere in the walls, a drip of condensation, a crack of old wood, the scurry of mice behind the tapestries. But most haunting of all was the sound of the king's voice, rising up through the stone, low and mournful, speaking to no one and everyone. At times he would shout names, Catherine, Anne, Jane, names that had long since turned to dust. At other times, he simply groaned, not from pain, but from the weight of a mind that could no longer distinguish flesh from phantom, you might have wondered, in the beginning, if you were imagining it, if this was merely the burden of stress, the fatigue of sleeplessness, the pressure of caring for the body of a crumbling god. But over time, you stopped questioning. The palace had its own way of speaking, its own rules, its own way of reminding you that no one served the king without being consumed by him. Once, on a cold morning in early spring, you walked into the royal chamber just as the sunlight broke through a slit in the wall. The rays struck the king's face, highlighting the crusted edge of his wound, the sagging jowl, the glazed pupils that had once made nations tremble. He looked at you and said, not with anger, but with something like wonder, "I remember when I rode horses. Do you think I could still?" You said nothing, only bowed. That was the trick, always bow. Never answer what should not be answered. There were no clocks in the palace. Time was measured in meals and moods. There were no hours, only conditions. If the king was in pain, it was a bad day. If the king slept, it was a mercy. If he demanded your presence, you ran. And when he did not, you waited with a quiet dread. Because too much silence could only mean the worst. The other courtiers watched you with a kind of polite horror. They did not envy you. You were not like the advisors, or the fools, or the tutors. You were the one who touched the truth. The one who smelled it, felt it, scrubbed it. You were the only man who could not lie to the king. Not entirely, and so you were the most dangerous. And yet, for all your learning, all your scrolls and scalpels, you could not save him, because he did not want to be saved. Not truly. He wanted to be obeyed. And the palace wanted to be feared. And you, well, you were just the man holding the bandage, listening to the ticking of the wound that no one else would acknowledge, trapped in a place where the gold on the walls could not cover the rot beneath the crown. And still, you stayed, because no one leaves the palace. Not really. Not while the king still breathes. There are things a physician can prepare for fevers that rise and fall with the moon. Lungs that rattle like dried leaves. Skin that bruises like overripe fruit. But nothing could prepare you for the wound on the king's leg. It was not a wound. Not really. It was a mouth angry. Open. Hungry. It breathed foulness into the room. Even when covered, it had a life of its own. Separate from the monarch it fed upon, it was the secret no portrait would reveal. The truth that curtsies and fanfare could not mask. It was the scream that never ceased. Even when silence reigned. It had started, they said, as a jousting injury, one of many. There had been blood and swelling. Perhaps a fracture beneath. That was years ago. Decades, maybe. Before the weight. Before the wives. Before the ulcers began to weep. Back then, he had been a warrior. A lion. He had dismissed the pain. Demanded more wine. Laughed through the limp. But it never healed. The skin thinned. The tissue blackened. And the royal surgeons tried everything. Salves. Poultices. Leeches. Cautery. Nothing stopped the rot. It deepened. Day by day. As if the body had decided that a piece of him no longer belonged. And so when you arrived, summoned from the safety of your studies, and flung into the chamber of royal decay, it was waiting for you. They handed you gauze, herbs, gloves soaked in vinegar, and told you to be brave. They did not tell you how the smell would cling to your hands no matter how many times you scrubbed. They did not warn you how the king would wince at your touch, then threaten your life if you hesitated. They did not explain that you would begin to dream of it, the glistening flesh, the yellow ooze, the way it pulsed when pressed, as if it were breathing through the bandages. It was always the leg, the right one. The swelling was worst, just above the knee. But the infection traveled, Some days, it felt like the entire leg was rotting from the inside. The limb would balloon with fluid, tight as a drum. The skin stretched and shiny. Threatening to split, you had to lance it, sometimes twice a day. The blade would sink in with a sound, not a scream. Not a shout, but a deep vet exhale, as if the body itself was relieved to be opened. What spilled out was not blood. Not exactly. It was thicker, browner, and smelled like meat left too long in the sun. The odor made the guards gag. It made the queen refuse to enter the room. But you had to lean in closer. There was one night you would never forget. The candles had burned low. Rain tapped on the windows. The king had cried out in his sleep. And the servants came for you. Eyes wide, voice low. You rushed in barefoot, pulling your robe tight. And there he was thrashing, moaning, one leg exposed. The linen soaked with something dark and spreading. You moved quickly. You always had to. There was no time for prayers. You removed the old dressing, and the wound, that terrible, glistening mouth, seemed to grow larger in the flicker of the flame. It pulsed, it shone, it whispered of death. You pressed your hands to it, fingers trembling, feeling the heat radiating like fire through cloth. The king stirred, muttered something about wolves. You reached for the blade, and in one motion, opened the wound once more. The fluid spilled over your wrists. Steaming. The king screamed. It echoed. It shook the rafters. But what chilled you most was not the pain in his voice. It was the fact that the scream came not from his throat, but from somewhere deeper. From the leg itself. As if the wound had found a voice at last. After that night, you began to speak to it, not aloud, but in your thoughts. You would wake with the taste of copper in your mouth, certain that the leg had whispered your name. You stopped eating. The smell lingered on everything. Your sheets, your pillow, even the pages of the books you tried to read to forget. The servants began to avoid you. They said your eyes had changed, that your hands twitched when still, that your shoes tracked something into the hall, something no one dared clean. And the king, he became more unpredictable. Some days he praised you, called you his healer, his savior. Other days, he accused you of cursing him, of feeding the wound with witchcraft, of letting his leg rot so his enemies could see him fall. You learned never to argue, only to bow, and whisper that the wound was shrinking, healing, disappearing even when you knew it wasn't. Because it was not just a wound anymore. It had become a symbol, a prophecy, a reminder that even the most powerful man in England could not escape the slow devouring of time and flesh. And you, the doctor, were now its keeper. You were the high priest of this festering altar. You anointed it daily. You measured its breath. You kept the secrets it told you in the dark. And each time you left that chamber, you carried a piece of it with you. Even now, years later, when the crown has passed to gentler heads, and the palace has been cleaned, painted, filled with music and light, there are corners where the wound still lingers. In the grain of the floorboards, in the stone beneath the throne, and in the memory of a physician who once believed that science could cure everything until he met a leg that refused to die. He ate like the world was ending, and he was determined to be the last man left with a full stomach. Morning, noon, and night. The king's table was a battlefield where no leaf, nor grain, no hint of moderation ever dared to stand. You might think that a man with a festering leg and a body bloated from years of self-indulgence would temper his appetite, that he might choose the gentle comfort of a broth, or the quiet kindness of a fruit. But Henry VIII was not that man. He had once seen restraint as weakness, and by the time his body began to crumble beneath him, it was too late. He had already declared war against his own flesh, and food had become both weapon and reward. It began, always, with meat. Every meal began with meat. Whole roasted birds stuffed with smaller birds, which in turn were stuffed with sweetened breadcrumbs, almonds, spices, and boiled eggs. There were hams glazed with honey and vinegar, haunches of venison glazed in wine, and pies. So many pies, crimped and golden, their crusts concealing layers of animal fat and pepper, their juices bleeding onto silver trays. The king's teeth, yellowed and sore, chewed slowly, but without pause. Even when the food pained him, he ate. Even when it choked him, he ate. The pleasure was no longer in the taste, it was in the power. And you, his doctor, watched helplessly from the corner of the great dining hall. You had tried to intervene. Once, perhaps twice. You had whispered warnings about his digestion, about his liver, about the strange swellings that rose beneath the skin of his neck after every feast. You had spoken of gout, of ulcers, of the need for vegetables. But he had laughed, fat and red-faced, his mouth filled with pheasant,
Your Majesty,
and waved you off with the back of his jeweled hand. Doctors, he had sneered, are like monks, always preaching, never feasting. What could you say to a king who saw himself as the embodiment of divine strength? Nothing. You bowed, you stepped back, and you watched as each day the meals grew longer, and the silences between them shorter. Food became not just sustenance, but distraction, a distraction from the pain, from the politics, from the whispers of mortality that crawled along the edges of the throne room like cold wind. But it was the sweets that changed him most. After the meats came, the sugared things, towers of candied fruit dipped in rosewater, marzipan sculptures of mythical beasts, jellied tarts, glazed apples, golden fritters dusted with powdered sugar that fell like snow upon his lap. His eyes glazed as he chewed, as though slipping into another world, a world where his body still obeyed him, where his leg did not scream and his doctors did not cower. He licked his fingers as a boy might. He ordered more, and when his teeth began to loosen in his gums, when he winced every time he bit down, he ordered the sweets to be pureed, spooned, melted, anything, so long as he did not have to stop. You began to notice the effects quickly. His skin grew slick and waxy. His hands trembled when lifting his goblet. His eyes, once sharp and cruel, now swam in a haze of sugar and wine. The wound on his leg flared hotter after every feast, the flesh more red, more violent. His breath carried the sourness of fermentation, as though his stomach itself had turned to a vat of ale. And then there was the sweat, a constant dampness that clung to his robes, that soaked the bedding, that scented every room he entered with a sweetness that was not sweet. You wanted to intervene. You wrote letters to your colleagues, but they went unread. You drafted new dietary guidelines, but they were laughed at by the stewards. No one denied the truth, but no one dared speak it either. Not to the king who executed wives, not to the king who burned advisors, not to the king who once declared that he, and he alone, could interpret the will of God, and so the food kept coming. One winter morning, just before dawn, you were summoned to the king's chamber. He had not eaten since the night before. His stomach, they said, had refused everything. You entered quietly, clutching a tonic of mint and vinegar, and found him sprawled across the sheets, his mouth slack, his eyes fluttering. His breath was shallow, and his skin, once flushed with wine and pride, had taken on a grey pallor, like ashes after fire. On the table beside him were the remnants of his final meal, a half-eaten pie, crust flecked with liver, a bowl of figs drowned in syrup, and the bones of a small bird, still wet from the mouth. You touched his wrist. The pulse stuttered. You leaned in to listen. His belly, vast and distended, groaned beneath your hand, as though trying to speak one last time. And then he turned to you, slowly, with great effort, and whispered something so quiet you could barely catch it. "Tell them," he said. I was still hungry, and that was the end. Not with a shout, not with a feast, not with the roar of cannons or the weeping of widows, but with a whisper, a hunger that outlived him. In the years that followed, they painted him again and again in armor, in furs, holding swords, standing tall, but never with a spoon, never with the swollen gut, never with the pale tongue searching for sugar, even as the body failed. That part was yours to carry. As his doctor, you had witnessed the truth, the gluttony, the decay, the royal appetite that devoured everything: country, council, wives, health, even the doctor who tried, once, to save him. The throne was not made to hold a man like him, not in the way he had become, not swollen with rage and weight, not blistered with disease, not boiling with humours and secrets and silent, sleepless nights. It had been carved for a king. Yes, but a younger king, one who stood upright, who walked the halls in armour and silk, who dazzled foreign envoys with his charm and disarmed his enemies with the tilt of his jaw. That king was gone now, buried beneath layers of meat and memory, and though no one dared say it aloud, the throne, that ancient, creaking symbol of England's power, was beginning to buckle beneath the sovereign it once exalted. It started subtly. The arms of the chair wore smoother with every day, not from use, but from pressure. The cushions, once velvet and proud, grew misshapen under the vastness of his body. The footstool had to be replaced twice, and then abandoned altogether, when it could no longer support the swollen ankles that throbbed beneath his robes. The very dais on which the throne sat had to be reinforced with beams from the navy yard, as if the king were now a ship too heavy to sit still without sinking into the boards. But these were not the only things breaking. Everywhere he went, the palace had to bend. The corridors were widened slightly, not publicly, not officially, but subtly, over months, so that his chair could pass without scraping. The doorways were rehung to open wider. The steps down to the chapel were smoothed flat, not for beauty, but because the king could no longer raise his knees high enough to climb. A wheeled platform was built, hidden in plain sight, disguised with gold and cloth. To carry him when walking became impossible, but even that groaned under his weight. The wheels squeaked, the footmen strained, and still, the king insisted on ceremony. Still, he demanded to be seen as he once was, towering, virile, invincible. It was a lie. Of course, but it was a royal lie, and that made it sacred. You watched this illusion unfold, with the quiet agony of someone who knew what lay beneath. You had seen the ulcer that never healed. You had drained the swelling, measured the bloating, touched the fevered skin with hands that trembled, despite your training. You had seen the flesh tearing, not from violence, but from pressure, from the sheer weight of being Henry. And you had seen what he could not, that the throne he sat on was no longer a seat of power. It had become a trap, a stage for a play no one dared cancel. There were moments private, quiet ones when he would let the mask slip. In the stillness before dawn, after a night of spasms and broken dreams, he would look at you with eyes that no longer burned, but begged. He would whisper strange things, fragments of fears, half-remembered prayers. Once, he asked if you thought the throne could forgive. Another time, he demanded to know if the cushion beneath him could feel the pain of holding him up. You never answered. You only listened. You only bowed. But the court around you refused to see. Or rather, they saw and refused to speak. They played their roles, lords and ladies, bishops and scribes all circling the throne, like moths pretending not to notice the fire. They praised his wisdom even as his thoughts scattered. They complimented his strength, even as he could not rise without 4 men to hoist him upright. They clapped when he waved, even when his arms shook from the effort. They lied, and they smiled, and they kept the charade alive, because it was safer to pretend than to confront the truth that sat heavy and heaving. At the center of it all, then came the day the throne cracked. It was a feast, one of many, loud and thick with smoke and sweat and the scent of overcooked game. He had demanded to be present, to be seen, to remind his court that he still ruled. The servants dressed him in stiff brocade, stuffed him into layers of cloth to shape his form into something vaguely royal. They painted his face with powder to hide the pallor. They perfumed his sleeves. They wheeled him in like a monument. And when he sat, oh, how he sat, the room held its breath. The wood groaned beneath him. It was small. At first, a faint sound, lost beneath the music. But then, a sharp crack.
The pain.
A sliver of noise that sent shivers down the spines of the servants who had lifted him.
He is not improving.
The throne did not collapse. Not completely, but it tilted. Just slightly. Just enough for everyone in the hall to notice. The king grunted. A goblet spilled. A dog barked. And then silence. You were there. You saw his face. Not rage. Not shame. Something worse. Recognition. He knew that his own body, swollen with pride and poison, had become too much. Even for the symbols that once exalted him, he knew the throne no longer obeyed. And for a moment, the briefest, cruelest moment, he looked not like a king, but like a man who had built a kingdom on a foundation that could no longer bear his weight. The throne was repaired. Of course, reinforced, polished, hidden beneath new cushions. But the crack had happened. It was real, and from that day forward, he sat differently, not taller, but tighter, not proud, but cautious, as if he feared that the next time he sat, the throne would not just bend, it would break. And when he could no longer leave his chambers, when the throne was replaced by a bed, it was not lost on you that the same beams used to strengthen the seat of England were now used to hold up the mattress where he lay, groaning, sweating, crumbling. The throne had not collapsed, but the man on it had, and in the end, you wondered, as all who served him must have wondered, whether he had ever truly sat on it at all, or whether, from the beginning, it had always been sinking. That perhaps the throne had always known what the king would not, that, no matter how many titles he carried, no matter how many wives he claimed or enemies he beheaded, no man, not even Henry, could escape the weight of his own undoing. In the end, death did not arrive as it had for the men he executed, swift and theatrical, beneath the open sky, before a crowd, with steel flashing and a nation holding its breath. No, death came for him slowly, with a silence more terrifying than screams, with shadows that grew not on the walls, but in the eyes of the servants who no longer knew how to meet his gaze. There was no final speech, no defiant roar, only a bed soaked in sweat, a leg that oozed and screamed without sound, and a body that once thundered through battlefields, now trembling under its own weight. It was a death that stretched across days like an illness, too grotesque to look at directly, too dangerous to ignore, and too holy to name aloud. They say a dying king is still a king, but in those final weeks, Henry VIII was more myth than monarch, more warning than ruler. He lay sprawled across the bed, not like a lion, but like the carcass of one, a great, heavy frame that had once been terrifying and now only smelled of rot and old meat. The physicians came and went, heads bowed, voice hushed, carrying bowls of herbs they knew would not work, wiping the sores they knew would never close. They no longer examined him to heal. They examined him to bear witness, The king was dying. That was no longer in question. What no one dared ask, what no one could bring themselves to ask, was who would be brave enough to be there when he actually died. Because Henry did not die gently. That would have been mercy. He died in pieces. His breath slowed, then quickened, then slowed again. His skin turned grey, then yellow, then blackened around the wound. His belly swelled, then shrank, then swelled again, as if something inside him could not make up its mind whether to leave or to linger. Some days he groaned, some nights he cursed. One evening, he wept, but no one dared to speak of it, not even in whispers. For weeks, the court told itself that he was simply resting, simply tired, simply ill. But everyone knew, and so they began to disappear. The servants started first fewer in the halls, quieter in the kitchens, their eyes filled with the kind of fear you only see in men who believe they might be buried with the king. Then the courtiers travelling, they claimed, to estates in the north, to urgent matters in Calais, to the comfort of wives and sons, far from the stench of the dying room. Even the priests, once eager to offer last rites, now came late and left early. No one wanted to be the last man standing in a room with the most dangerous corpse in England, because what if he opened his eyes again? What if he changed his mind? What if the breath returned just long enough to name a new heir? To order one more execution? To damn one more soul? And so the palace held its breath. And the king, the man who had unmade monasteries, unseated popes, undone wives and nations, was left alone. Or nearly so. Sometimes a nurse, sometimes a trembling physician, sometimes a page boy who had drawn the shortest straw. But no one of consequence, no one who mattered, no one who could claim to have truly witnessed the last breath of Henry VIII. You were there longer than most. You watched the days blur. You listened to the walls groan. You cleaned the linens and changed the bandages and dabbed the sweat from the ridge of his brow. Though he no longer knew your name, you watched his mouth open and close without words. You saw his fingers twitch, his eyes roll back, his chest rise just barely beneath the weight of the sheets. You felt, in your bones, that the man you had once feared, once served, once studied like a patient in a puzzle, was no longer truly inside that body. But still, you stayed, not for him, but for history, because someone had to remember what it looked like when a god turned back into meat. And then, in the stillness before dawn on a day, no one would mark. In a room, no one had entered for hours. The breath simply stopped. There was no thunder, no flickering light, no sign from the heavens, just silence. Heavy, final. You leaned in close, listening for the breath you no longer believed would come. You waited for the twitch that had not returned in days. You touched his wrist and found it cold, but still soft, as though the blood had only just decided it would no longer serve. You stood, you stepped back, and you said nothing, because the truth was this: the king had not truly died in that moment. He had died across years. He had died when the throne cracked beneath him. He had died when he could no longer walk through his own palace without pain. He had died when his doctors stopped treating him and started obeying him. He had died when he ate his own strength away, bite by bite, beneath chandeliers and trumpets. He had died when the wound on his leg became more feared than his laws. He had died each time he signed a name to a death warrant and then forgot the face it belonged to. And when his final breath came, it did not take anything that had not already been surrendered. Outside, the sun began to rise. The palace creaked. Somewhere, a page turned, and history, like always, began its work of cleaning up what the body had left behind. The king was dead, but no one knew what to do with him. Not really. Not in a way that felt safe, or sacred, or even clean. For so long, Henry VIII had been a presence so immense, so swollen with threat and appetite and divine proclamation that his absence now felt like a breach in the walls of reality. His body, still enormous in death, lay draped in sheets that could no longer contain the smell or the truth. The man who had filled every hallway with his breathless temper, who had once demanded that heads be separated from shoulders for looking at him incorrectly, now lay still in a bed, too small for his decay, and no one, not priest, not noble, not heir, seemed eager to be the first to touch him. There had been no clear plan, or rather, there had been plans written in scrolls, debated by councils, altered as politics shifted, but none of them accounted for the stench. None of them addressed what should be done if the royal body began to betray itself before ceremony could catch up. And now, in the deepest corner of the palace, that betrayal was underway. The ulcer on his leg, unwrapped for final inspection, had split. The wound had opened like a mouth, as if to speak one final curse, and from it came not just fluid, but the unmistakable scent of meat too long forgotten. It filled the room. It climbed the curtains. It buried itself in the fabrics of the throne room, where preparations were quietly, nervously, beginning. You were there. Still, you had not left. Though you had been given permission to do so, they called it rest. You called it guilt. You remained because you had witnessed the unraveling and now felt bound to see it through. You stood beside the corpse and understood what no one else dared speak. This was not just a man's body. It was a symbol, and symbols, when they rot, do so loudly. For 2 days, the corpse was left untouched. Men passed through, glanced, whispered, departed. A bishop offered a blessing from the doorway but would not step inside. The Queen Dowager wept in another room, but did not approach. Even Edward Young, newly crowned, unsure whether he had inherited a kingdom or a funeral pyre, was kept away. The truth was too brutal for ceremony, too wet, too human. Finally, it was decided that the body must be moved, not for burial, that was still weeks away, scheduled with all the pomp the Church of England could muster, but to a holding chamber, something colder, something stone. They wrapped him in linen, thick and oiled, but it was not enough. The fluid seeped through. The carriage was lined with herbs, but even the rosemary recoiled. 4 men carried him, but one slipped, nearly buckling under the weight. The body tilted. A sound escaped from inside, not a groan, not a breath, but the gasp of a stomach torn too soon from silence. The doors were closed, locked, sealed with wax and prayer, and still, the smell leaked. In the days that followed, the palace changed. Servants whispered in corners about the curse of kings who die unshriven. Guards refused to walk the lower halls alone. Dogs howled at nothing. Mice scurried from under the locked door, their fur tinged with the scent of death. The royal physicians, once praised for their knowledge, now found themselves avoided like plague-bearers. And you, the last to touch him while his blood still moved, were treated as a relic of something people now hoped to forget. The procession, when it finally came, was a thing of contradiction. Drums beat, horses stumped, crowds wept and threw flowers. The coffin, sealed in gold, lined with velvet, fitted with chains, was paraded through streets that had already heard the rumors. That the king had burst, that his stomach had opened like a sack, that the floor beneath his bed had been scorched with lime. No one knew what was true. No one wanted to know, but the scent lingered, even in the open air. The tomb was ready. Windsor had prepared. Beneath the chapel, next to Jane Seymour, the only wife he had not cast aside, the vault had been cleared. They lowered him in with silence, each man glancing at the others, wondering if this was truly the end, or merely a pause in a story that had already lasted too long. Earth was laid, prayers were said, Stone was fitted. And then they walked away. But the problem with burying a man like Henry was this. He did not stay buried. His weight remained in the halls, his breath in the tapestries, his rage in the politics of sons, who now feared what they might become. The court spoke of him in past tense, but looked over their shoulders when they did. His portrait, still hung in the great hall, seemed to watch more intently than ever, as if the man inside knew what they had done, how they had left him to rot while pretending to mourn. And you carried the image of his face in those final days, slack-jawed, glistening, open. You remembered the sound of his body breaking, the smell of linen soaked in fluids no one could name. You remembered the silence of a room that had once housed thunder. And most of all, you remembered the one question he had asked you, on the final night when he could still speak. Will they remember me as a god? You had not answered. You could not. But now, standing outside the tomb, you thought to yourself, no, not a god. A man who ate like a god, ruled like a storm, and died like something the earth itself struggled to reclaim. A corpse that no one dared touch, a legacy that no one could quite bury. Long after the tomb was sealed, after the last shovel of earth was flattened and the last candle burned out in the chapel's cold air, there remained a silence that did not lift. It wasn't the peace of mourning, nor the sacred quiet of legacy. No. This was a different kind of stillness, one that clung like humidity, that settled deep into the beams of the palace, that echoed in the halls even when footsteps returned. Henry VIII was gone, but the sound of him not being there was louder than any of his roars had ever been. The courtiers returned first, their shoes clicking softly against the stone as if they feared waking something. They spoke in measured tones, heads inclined, lips dry. The laughter was gone. So too was the music. The feasts shrank. The velvet was left unpolished. No one asked for roasted swan or dancing girls. No one dared mention the leg. The smell, the slow unraveling of a king who had once seemed invincible. It was as if, to speak of him too clearly, too soon, might invite the grave to breathe him back up. And in that hush, history began to edit. Documents were rewritten. Portrait touched up. The stories told to visiting ambassadors were carefully pruned. The legacy of the great king was shaped not by what he had become, but by what they wished he had remained. The lion in armor, the scholar, the father of a new church, the fearsome lover, the righteous sword, never the man groaning in his sleep, nor the mouth gasping for breath, nor the hand trembling over a spoonful of sugar. The silence buried those things, smoothed them over like marble over a bruise. But you knew. You had walked the final corridor. You had held the wet cloth against a brow that no longer burned, because the fire had already fled. You had stood at the foot of his bed as the last breath left, not with defiance, but like a sigh from a man who had lost count of what he was fighting for. And now you stood in the court again, surrounded by silks and oil lamps, and murmured prayers for a new dawn. And you knew they were lying, not out of malice, not even out of ambition, but because they had to, because no kingdom survives the full truth of the monster it loved. They said Henry had died with dignity. They said he had ruled with brilliance. They said his reign had forged unity and strength. But you had seen the servants weep not from grief, but from relief. You had heard the priests whisper that the devil himself would not argue over that soul. You had watched the rats flee the bed before the men did. So the silence remained, not as an absence, but as a guard, a veil across the memories too foul to honor, too recent to forget. And in that silence, something new grew. Fear. Yes, but also something softer. A hesitation. A pause before every decision. Before every law. Before every punishment. As if the walls themselves were whispering, remember what happens when one man takes too much. Young Edward, now king in name, ruled beneath the shadow of that silence. He asked questions no one wanted to answer. He studied scriptures his father had once burned. He walked the corridors at night, and the guards said he often stopped by the throne and stared, not with longing, but with something more akin to dread. He was already being shaped by what had come before, not by Henry's laws, but by his absence, not by his sword, but by the hole he had left behind. And you became part of the silence too. You wrote nothing. You spoke only when asked. You carried the memory of the man's decay, the way a soldier carries a scar, not proudly, but unflinchingly. You saw what legacy really meant, not statues or songs, but the ache of remembering what others are paid to forget. Years passed. The silence settled. It became tradition. It became comfort. The new kings and queens would speak of Henry only in controlled sentences. With carefully chosen titles, they would walk past his portraits and nod, but not stop. They would bless his name, but never ask too closely how he met his end. And so, the silence became legend. But you knew, and perhaps always would, that the real echo of his reign was not in what he built or broke, not in the wives or wars or churches, but in the quiet that followed. The kind of quiet that makes people walk faster down long halls. The kind of quiet that keeps lamps burning longer than needed. The kind of quiet that outlives even a king. They say that when a king dies, the land exhales. That bells toll, flags lower, and life begins again, reshaped but unbroken. But that was not what happened when Henry died. The bells tolled. Yes, the banners dropped. The courtiers bowed and the priests chanted and the funeral processions wound their way through towns too tired to cheer. But the land did not exhale. It held its breath, and it still hasn't let go. Because Henry VIII was not a king you could bury in a vault and leave behind. Not truly. His body lies beneath the stone at Windsor, sealed beside the woman who gave him his only son. In a grave meant to be final, but graves are for men. And Henry had ceased to be just a man long before death claimed him. He had become something else, something stitched together from fear and appetite, from divine decree and human ruin, from laws written in blood and songs sung through gritted teeth. He was not buried. He was contained, and even that did not last. The truth is, some kings linger, not as ghosts. No ghosts are pale and trembling and quiet. Henry lingers as weight, as scent. As memory lodged in the spine, he exists in the hesitation before a command, in the tremble of a servant's hand, in the silence after the laughter stops. They tried to erase the stench of his final days with incense and scripture, but the smell of rot does not care for prayer. They tried to sculpt him into glory, but the stone always cracks. And every king after him, every son, every daughter, every monarch who has sat upon the throne he once broke with his body has felt him underfoot. There are whispers, still, that the floorboards beneath the throne were never quite the same, that no matter how many times the chamber was cleaned, the scent returned in damp corners, in locked rooms, in the folds of old velvet, that no one walks past the tomb at Windsor at midnight. Not because they believe in ghosts, but because some truths are heavier than any haunting. They say the rats returned to the chapel weeks later, that one of the tapestries had to be removed after it refused to dry, that sometimes, if you sit very still in the great hall, you can hear not music, not voices but breath, laboured, wet, distant, as though someone is still waiting for his next meal. You tell yourself it's just a story. You close the book and remind yourself that Henry is long gone, that the world has moved on, that the crown has changed, that the kings and queens now rule in velvet and polish and modernity. But deep down, beneath your ribs, you know better. You know that history does not erase. It seeps. So tonight, as you lie beneath your blankets. Let this be your lullaby, not of princes and fairy tales, but of the truth behind the stone. That power leaves a mark. That hunger, when fed too long, becomes its own creature. That silence can scream louder than any sword, and that somewhere, in the spaces, no one dusts. The king who could not be buried still waits not to return, not to speak, but simply to remind us that the body may rot, but the shadow never fades. So sleep now, if you can, but if you dream, do not dream of crowns.